This is the Awful Announcing Podcast. Here's your host, Brandon Contes.
Alrighty, welcome to episode 66 of the Awful Announcing Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Contes, and this week we are joined by Mike Golic Jr., formerly of ESPN and ESPN Radio. Now he co-hosts GoJo and Golic over at DraftKings with his dad. Mike, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. Fresh off being in the audience for Celebrity Family Feud to watch Mina and Pablo Torre, which was undeniably electric. Pablo puts the team on his back, orchestrates one of the greatest comebacks ever. What was it like seeing that live?
It really was. I said yesterday, maybe the most electric atmosphere I'd been a part of, and obviously been fortunate to call a number of football games and be around that, called the Nathan's hot dog eating contest when I was at ESPN, although the caveat I give to people is I didn't get to call the ones on the corner of Surf and Stillwell in the middle of it. This was pandemic and immediately post-pandemic. Yeah. This was unbelievable, and the tension in the room when David Chang goes up there and puts up the 54 spot in the first part of Fast Money. And as someone who's watched a ton of Family Feud in my lifetime, believes Steve Harvey is the greatest modern television game show that's ever existed, and seeing just the way he set up everything going into Pablo, and the way Pablo, like Will Ferrell in Old School, blacked out for this moment where he absolutely came through in the clutch. It was one of the most clutch sports performances we will see in 2024. I can firmly stamp it with that, having been there in person and then watched it again last night on TV.
Yeah. No, that was incredible. Was it taped yesterday? Monday? We're recording this Tuesday morning. Was it taped on Monday or was it earlier?
No, it was earlier than that. I forget when exactly it was, but no, this was taped pretty far in advance of this. And so knowing it was out there and remembering the feeling that happened. And let me tell you, as an audience member for this, I had no idea how involved being a game show audience member is. They coach you up. It has got to be effort and energy in the entire way to make sure it sounds as fun as it does when you watch it on TV back home. So not to say that Pablo doesn't deserve a ton of credit for doing the work up on the stage, but I feel like those of us doing our part in the audience probably not going to get talked about enough in this. So I'm going to give a voice to the voiceless, who are probably hoarse like me after their appearance in that crowd.
Right. Yeah, no, you certainly added to the atmosphere for sure. How did you end up in the crowd? Like, did Mina and Pablo invite you? Were you there for moral support, or are you just a big Family Feud fan?
It was all the above. So huge Family Feud fan. Mina and Pablo told me that this was something they were going to get to be a part of. And I normally like to play it pretty cool. You know, I'm fortunate to work in an industry where a lot of my friends get cool opportunities. And I don't want to be the mooch trying to tag along on too much of that. But this one, I straight up told them, I said, if there is any way you can get me in the audience for Celebrity Feud, I'll do whatever it needs to do. So they were kind enough to make that happen. It was the last time I had appeared on Pablo Torre Finds Out with him and Mina doing an episode for that show. Then I threw my hat into the ring. And so they were able to make it happen there because, I've been watching this show forever. They got to live a dream of mine and going up there and being on it. And so pumped to be there, was honored to be around that entire operation and to get to watch them make history.
And where did your friendship with Pablo and Mina, where did you guys kind of forge that? Was that highly questionable? Was it earlier than that?
It was earlier than that, yeah. So Mina and I both started, Mina had been writing at ESPN already for the magazine at the time, but both of us got our start on radio at the same time period or around there. Fall of 2015, I had been on the Fantasy Focus radio show with Dave Rothenberg, Eric Karabell, and Stefania Bell on Sunday mornings on ESPN radio. The next year, when I got moved to Weekend Observations with Stu Gatz, Sunday 7 to 9, they had Mina go and join the Fantasy Focus show as sort of her first real venture into doing on air in front of camera stuff consistently there for them. And so that had her out in Bristol one weekend. We just decided to grab lunch. We had been familiar with each other online. I had obviously read a bunch of Mina stuff at that point, so got to know her then, and then got to know Pablo, as we got into more of the highly questionable stuff and what that became post Dan and Bomani on that show, or when him and Bomani started to really take the reins on that show. And yeah, just always got along super well with both of them. They've got a great perspective. They're two of the best at what they do in the industry, and just a ton of fun as people to hang out with. They're both a really good time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool. Pablo's at Meadowlark now. You're at DraftKings, obviously. Mina's still at ESPN. Cool to see the family feud bringing that all together. Have any of the Golics ever done Family Feud?
No, we haven't. And again, we will shamelessly throw our hat in the ring for that, because it is what we saw with Pablo there has been an ongoing conversation among our family of, if we were ever fortunate enough to get in that situation, who do you send out for fast money? Because that's an incredibly high stakes, high pressure environment. And everyone thinks right away, oh, me and dad do the stuff on TV and do the stuff in front of an audience all the time. Surely it'd be you, but you know, my brother is someone who watches game show stuff all the time. My mom is really dialed into, I think, a lot of the questions that America gives the answer to on those polls. And so, yeah, we have not yet gotten our chance at that, but would relish the opportunity for sure.
Yeah, and I think there's probably more pressure on you and your dad. Like, because if it doesn't go well, then that's going to be all over social media. If your mom doesn't do well, like, you know, no one's really going to get on her too much.
No, the thing that would be funniest though is, and you saw a little bit of this, one of my favorite parts about this group on Family Feud was Mina, when she's in a high, like a high energy environment like that, having done the draft show with her at ESPN, where I famously got screamed at by her when the Seahawks picked DK Metcalf, she gets amped up in the thrill of competition. And Mina, at one point, there was audio of her when they were putting up the answers on the board where she said, "These are so dumb."
Yeah.
She can't hold back. And it's the same thing, you know, the trope on Family Feud where every time someone gives the answer, everyone else claps and goes, "Good answer." My family would probably turn on each other pretty quick if one person gave too many stupid answers in a row. So I don't know if you'd have that same level of just garden variety camaraderie if we're not each holding up our end of the bargain.
Yeah, I think that's a good selling point, though. That would the drama would be interesting. And then also, how do they coach the audience up to react to something like that? Like, if you guys are turning on each other and they're used to just telling the audience, just applaud, like, that's going to be an interesting dynamic too. Speaking of shows that everybody watches, were you like the rest of us who were born in the late 80s and watching Saved by the Bell reruns on TBS every day?
Yeah, I watched a little bit of Saved by the Bell as a kid growing up, enough to kind of be familiar with it. I don't think I was a day in, day out watcher, but enough to, like everybody else, to where it was a part of my life in the background for sure.
So was it strange seeing your uncle on the college years, or were you kind of desensitized to seeing your family on TV?
I think the latter, just again, because of the way I grew up, that was definitely abnormal in that regard. I always say it took me a long time to figure out that turning on the TV when I was in the training room at college and seeing Dad and Greeny on there was abnormal, that wasn't a part of life. You know, I knew it wasn't a part of life for everyone, but it had always been a part of mine in a way that felt insanely normal. But with Bob, the interesting part always is, as much success as my dad and my Uncle Bob both had as NFL players for a long time, and obviously Dad since then has gone on to have one of the most prolific careers in the history of sports talk radio, the number one name recognition point for me when I was out in public, whether it was in college or since, is always Saved by the Bell, the college years, which is amazing because it's not like the college years had some massive run of success either. But
yeah, nobody really even liked the college years. Saved by the Bell fans were not really huge fans of the college years.
No, and so the fact, it's one of those reminders that we get pretty often working in sports, that the world outside of us is so much bigger and carries so much more weight than what we think is going on here in our little bubble.
Yeah, for sure. So when did you decide to follow in the footsteps of your dad and your uncle and just wanting to get into sports media? Was that something that you had decided at a young age that you wanted to pursue?
Yeah, I think in high school is when I really knew that this was something that I wanted to pursue. I always said I was a chubby fat kid who liked to talk, and so playing football for as long as I could and then talking about it were things that went hand in hand. I liked holding court and having, the normal debates that we have in locker rooms, the same stuff that you have in barbershops or on sports talk radio. Like, that's what we all sit and talk about. The amount of LeBron Jordan debates that I had at Notre Dame sitting around the locker room were too many to count. And so I think just having a natural comfort there. And for me, growing up and wanting to be like my dad in so many ways because of the man that he was, but certainly what I saw him do professionally, I don't have memories from when he was a player. I was so young. I was born in 1989. Dad played from 85 till through the 93 season. And so I was a little kid. I don't remember him as a football player as much. I've heard stories about it. I've heard him talk about those teams. But what I saw was him as the broadcaster. And I always really enjoyed that. I got to go around with him when I was a kid, when he was calling college football games with Dave Barnett and Bill Curry. And so I think all of that just kind of showed me, okay, this is a career path for someone who has a similar personality and certainly loves sports in the same way that my dad does.
So you mentioned seeing Mike and Mike on in the training room at Notre Dame. Did you watch and listen to Mike and Mike before school? Like, were you paying attention to it regularly?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I always joked that it was the only thing Mom would let us listen to. She was the one that when Dad was there, she would drive us to school before I had my driver's license. But no, it was the background to our life. And I mean, listen, that show changed my family's life forever. There's no sugarcoating that. I mean, it was an incredible run and something that we were blessed to have a front row seat to for that long. But yeah, that's because I get the thing in public still now when people come up to me. I've been fortunate to do this for a while now, and I feel good about my career path. But I understand when people see me, by and large, they think of Dad. And so when most people see me out in public, especially men of a certain age, they're like, oh man, I loved your dad. Like, tell him I loved him on Mike and Mike for so long. And there's no real easy answer for me to that because Dad's not there and someone's giving me a compliment about someone else. But it is just a reminder. And the thing I always say to them is, no, it was the same for me too. Like for these people that had that as the memory when, they had a moment with their parents or their children, or when they were going through the birth of a child, and Mike and Mike was this thing in the background for all these formative moments for so many people. I always tell them it was the same for me. This was the show that I grew up with, around, and in a lot of ways a part of, as a show that always made a point that they were going to talk about their families. That was the decision that Dad and Greeny made pretty early on in that show. And something we were well aware of is this was going to be a family show, and that part of their lives was, I think, a connective point that so many people that were fans of that show appreciated. But it also let us know that, hey, you're growing up in the fishbowl. The things that you do that are funny are going to make it on air, and that's going to be a part of what we talk about. Was that ever uncomfortable for you? Not then, because again, we didn't really know any better. It wasn't until years later, and especially as I started doing this as a profession, that I realized, it did kind of, change the way that I thought about relationships in my life, where I was conscious of, hey, are there certain people that are here because they actually like you versus here because of, hey, you've got the nice house, you've got the things that come with, having a dad that's on TV, people that are aware of that. And so I think it did make me aware, too, in a way that I always talk about with young athletes coming up, because, playing at a place like Notre Dame, guys that play big-time college sports or at any level, you're always told, hey, in most cases it's, hey, there's a lot of young eyes watching you. You have a responsibility to be a role model to these young people. But it's also, hey, especially in this day and age now with social media as prolific as it is, you've always got eyes. A camera's always close by you here, and you've got to make sure you conduct yourself accordingly. I had a good sense for that at a pretty young age, just because I knew, hey, my last name, it means something beyond just myself, and it does for everyone. But in this case, it was something so public-facing that I was pretty cognizant of how I conducted myself was always going to reflect back to Dad because of the nature of his job. Did it seem like you were watching your dad and listening to your dad, or did it seem like you were watching and listening to your dad playing a character? Oh, no. My dad's stock line has always been true for him as it is for me now is, hey, just be yourself because you ain't smart enough to be anybody else. And it's self-deprecating because that's part of, the whole shtick. But no, Dad was always himself. And I think that was the coolest part was I got to share my dad with a whole bunch of other people. And I love my dad a ton. My whole family does. We've been so fortunate to have a father that away from the microphone has always poured into us. He was never someone that cared. I always say my dad's like the worst semi-famous person ever. Has no idea how big the show was. He's constantly surprised when other people, actors, prominent athletes now come up to him and talk to him about how much the show meant to them. He had no idea because he's always just been my dad. He's always just been himself and has never really been concerned with being anybody else. He's the most comfortable person in his skin I've ever met. And it's always something I've been very jealous of, because just the way I'm wired mentally, that's always been a lot tougher to come by for me. But he has such a natural self-confidence and assurance in who he is and what he brings to everything. That no, there was never a character with him. What you saw on air and what you continue to see on air through 2+ decades, almost 3 decades, has been exactly who we get at home. And that's been the cool part of all this.
Were there other sports shows and sports radio shows that you listened to and watched at that time?
Growing up, less so. It got to be more so into like adulthood. Like when I think about, especially like my young formative years getting into this industry, and the people that really had an effect. Like I watched and listened to a ton of the Dan Le Batard show. I remember tweeting Stu Gatz about how I wanted to work with him, which eventually led to us doing that 27-hour fantasy football marathon together that, sparked a friendship both on and off air that lasts through today. But shows like that, for me, Jamel Hill and Michael Smith at ESPN, what they were doing with, Numbers Never Lie, and then every show iteration from there on out, his and hers through the 6, Michelle Beadle and the folks over at Sports Nation. I kind of like the authenticity with Dad. I was always drawn to people where I could tell, and then got to find out later when I met these people and got to form relationships with them off air, that they were themselves on air and off air. There was no change when the microphones clicked on for who they were going to be in private and in public. And those were the shows that showed me, you can just have fun with your friends on air and it be something compelling enough for people want to give their time to. So those were always the shows that, especially, like I said, there's one thing to wanting to do it because I loved watching my dad do it. I was passionate about it myself, but I didn't grow up like a sports talk radio junkie like Stu Gatz and a lot of these guys outside of Mike and Mike until much later on when I started consuming more of this. And those were the shows that ended up being at the top of the list. And those are people, again, I always say, every chance I get, so indebted to people like Michael and Jamel, people like Michelle, who, as a kid coming in with the nepotism tag on him at ESPN in the way that I did, and it was self-conscious and understood, hey, if there were people that looked at me sideways because of the way that I came into this, I understood it. It was my job to go in there and show them with how I worked that I was going to honor the opportunity I got that someone else didn't, because that's the reality of the situation. And from the jump, especially people out in Bristol, people like Michael and Jamel, people like El Duncan, Kevin Nagandi, all these people that treated me like a peer, like someone that wasn't just Mike Golic's son at that company. And whether it was the on-air opportunities or whether it was the friendship away from that, I don't know if they had any idea. They were just being themselves, being kind people, but how much of an impact that had on me as a young broadcaster and a person that was trying to find myself in an industry where my name already meant something because of someone else's work.
You mentioned you started hosting a show in 2015, I think you said. So was that at that point, were you done trying to get into the NFL? Because you had signed with the Steelers for an off season and then the Saints twice.
Yeah, so I always say in 2015, football had made it pretty clear it was done with me, which is the line we always hear from guys. Most people get retired, and to retire, you would have actually had to have had a career. I didn't. I went to I went to the Steelers training camp as a rookie. I went to Saints off-season program the next year. I got cut in the middle of June and then went to CFL training camp, played in one of the expansion leagues, the FXFL, which folded after a year. I went back to camp with the Saints and went through the full training camp with them in fall of 2015. And it kind of knew at that point, like, hey, like, third year, haven't made a practice squad or an active roster. You're already bordering on a camp body, but let's give it one more go. Let's try and put good tape out there and see what happens. And if not, spoiler alert, you don't make a lot of money when you're not making rosters in any way. So between that and just wanting a career that, was going to want me back at that point, I couldn't make that happen with professional football, and that's on me. And so, once I got to fall of 2015, Justin Craig, who had been a producer on Mike and Mike for a number of years and was, ended up being my boss in radio at the time at ESPN, was someone who, when he was working at 98.7 ESPN in New York, when I was with that expansion team, I was the Brooklyn Bolts. So I was living in a Holiday Inn Express in Staten Island for a few months, playing minor league football over at the Cyclone Stadium. And Justin was working at ESPN New York at the time and said, hey, if you've got time in the weekend, there's a couple of shows. Come and sit in and do an hour with a couple of these shows, 2 hours with a couple of these shows. Start to get your feet wet. And so that opportunity spilling into that fall where it was just, hey, whatever you guys have on the weekends, if there's any place where I can get my foot in the door here, I'd be happy to try and make that happen. And yeah, so that was that fall where football was firmly done. I dropped 25 pounds by December, which felt awesome. And being able to walk into, Lululemon and buy off the rack was a nice experience after that. But yeah, football had made it very clear to me I wasn't a part of its future plans.
So you were doing local stuff at 98.7, or Justin Craig was putting you on national stuff early on?
No, that was local stuff early on. So that was their, local weekend programming at the time, because that was when I had free time.
Yeah. Was it hard going on the radio and having to potentially criticize players or teams that you played with and even teams that you were just so recently cut from?
Yeah, I mean, the hardest part was I was criticizing a bunch of guys that were objectively better at the job I had been trying to do. And so, you go through that imposter syndrome of what right do I have? And leaning on Dad in those moments was really helpful because, Dad had a 9-year NFL career, but sports media and the history of it for a while, it was, hey, you had to be a quarterback to talk about this. And then, hey, you had to be a gold jacket to talk about this. My dad was a guy that was, a backup player that became a starter, that was a part of a lot of really great teams. And I think really kicked down the door for a lot of other players who didn't necessarily have a Hall of Fame career to go out and be really compelling broadcasters. And so I talked to him a lot about that and, get reminded of the importance of stuff that I think still matters to the way I want to talk about this today, which is, hey, when you're criticizing something, you're criticizing the action, you're criticizing a decision. You're not necessarily criticizing the person and making it personal. And those things still hold true for me now, but were really helpful then when I was a lot more insecure about it. Yeah.
So did it take time for yourself to feel comfortable on the radio? Like you mentioned, the self-confidence that your dad has, exceeds your own. Did it take time to develop that confidence to feel like you could be open and comfortable talking to an audience on the radio?
Yeah, and I think to feel like I belonged there, I think that took a while. I mean, I started on air, so it was 2015 that fall. I was probably 26 years old in that range, and I would say I was 3-4 years in as like a 29-year-old when it finally started to feel like, okay, I know what I bring to the table. And that was just through sheer volume of reps and being fortunate that so many people there were willing to take a chance on me. And again, I know why they did originally, because I have the last name of someone that was really important in that building. There's no hiding from that. And so again, it was, all right, what am I going to do with that opportunity? But I was lucky that I got so many opportunities from, Justin Craig and all the people there that put me on air as early as they did and gave me the chance to get that time in front of a microphone to find out who you are on air. I was talking to someone about that the other day. Like, everyone says be yourself on air, but trying to figure that out within all of the different parameters that exist, whether it's radio that's different from podcasting, that's different from the digital work, that's different from the TV studio and game work that I did there. And getting a chance to wear all those different hats so often, so early in my career, gave me an opportunity to figure out, all right, what's the consistent thing I can bring to the table? Bomani Jones was a guy doing Highly Questionable, working with him and Pablo, that, reminded me, he's like, hey, your experience might not be your dad's or some gold jackets, but you've still also done things that a lot of other people haven't had to do, and you've had those experiences. Use that stuff, lean into it, and having, having people like Mina and Pablo, Jason Fitz, who I got to work with a lot, all of whom, again, treated me like a peer, went out and did shows with me where I got to feel like a valuable part. All of them played a huge part in me growing to a point where I felt like I was myself on air in a way that I could be comfortable replicating no matter what platform I was on.
Yeah. And you want to sound confident and comfortable on air, and you want to be able to bring those life experiences and talk about your personal life and stuff like that. But at times, I'm sure sports can almost become like a bit of a crutch where if you're not comfortable talking about those other things, and then now you're talking about sports on a sports show almost too much, and you don't want to risk just like not connecting with anybody because now you're like, well, I'm not comfortable talking about that stuff. I'm just going to stick to sports. And it can become almost monotonous.
It can. I'd see that's the irony is the being myself on air was finding the blend that actually involved more sports. Like I was good at talking about the fun stuff and still am. That part of me personality wise, that's good. But a lot of it was who I was as a sports analyst based on not having that extensive pro career to draw on and figuring out, oh no, in addition to, listen, like pop culture references, fun with food, all the stuff that people associate with my dad, I can do that stuff. I'm super confident in that. But it was then, all right, finding the right marriage of that and being a value add when it comes to the sports stuff. I think we have so many great analysts, especially, just using football, the sport that I cover most often. We've got so many great analysts right now and so much access to information that allows even more voices in this. Pablo and Mina are a testament to that. Neither of them played a down of football at a high level, but it doesn't matter. They offer a compelling perspective because of the work they put into it. I've seen it firsthand. Mina Kimes, probably the hardest working person in this industry I've ever seen up close. And so it was trying to figure out, all right, what part of that, making sure that I'm dutiful with that in the same ways that I see from those other people, and then trying not to, copy other people that I see, their style, the way that they approach analysis, and figuring out, hey, what's my vantage point to see the game through and how can that be valuable? I can love the way Dan Orlovsky breakdown plays. I can love the way my dad explains the game, but based on my background, what's the best avenue and entry point for me and how I'm going to try and present football or any of these other sports to the people that watch and consume it?
So when did you end up getting the national lead-in show to Mike and Mike? How long after you started doing some part-time work at ESPN Radio did you then get that show?
I want to say that was either spring of 2016.
Okay, so
when they announced that with me and Robin Lundberg, who I had gotten to work with one of those times in New York. It did a 2-hour morning show with him the Monday after a national championship that I believe Ohio State won. I think that was that 2014-15 year. And they were bringing that up to the national level with Robin, who had been doing it already in New York. And so that was when he and I started there, I believe, spring of 2016.
How was that? How was getting to be the lead into your dad's show then at that point?
You know what's funny is I didn't have time to think about that part of it because I was just trying to figure out how to do the job every day. And I was so lucky to have Robin there, who understands audio at such a high level and understood how to hook people in, the transitions, the way to structure a show, was really good at putting together arguments and just driving the ship for that show in a way that I hadn't had to do at that point yet and didn't have to until, unfortunately, he was a part of that first round of layoffs at ESPN that I was there to experience, and I ended up hosting that show solo after that. And he was the first person I called, obviously, to check in, but also to just ask him how he did that. And he was the one that told me, once you can host by yourself on radio, everything else is going to feel easy about this job. And so getting to do that with him was such an incredible learning experience, because 4 to 6, most of our bosses are barely even up then listening. It's, truck drivers. And as I found out, a lot of college football and NFL football coaches going into the office early in the morning listening at that time. And so it was a great environment to learn from someone who had done it at a high level in Robin, but also to make mistakes, to hear myself on air, to get that feedback from people like Justin Craig in that office who took that time to listen to me, to help me sound check, and to do all those things that I think definitely helped make me a better broadcaster early on.
Were you doing that show from New York or Bristol?
No, from Bristol.
And so Robin as well,
did his
or
leg
Robin
from New York. I did, that was well pre-pandemic.
Yeah,
so
right. That was early on to be doing remote shows like that with co-hosts for sure.
Yeah, it was wild. And so we were, even back then, I don't remember if it was Zoom or what the app was, but we'd pull up something to have us on video so we could see each other for all of those nonverbal cues and interviews and everything. And yeah, it was definitely interesting to get used to. But again, like the most important thing outside of, I always say, in football, my dad was the best and most important coach I ever had because he laid the foundation for my game. And in broadcasting, it's the same way. But my experience doing that show was the most invaluable thing, or the most valuable part of my sports media experience, getting to be in front of a microphone every day for that long and having to figure out what to do with it.
Did your dad listen to your shows and give feedback, or was it more just like you asking him questions about things that you wanted to know?
I think more the latter. Like dad was always a good extra set of ears, whether it was, me calling games, which I got to start doing later on, or, doing the shows in and around his show. I think he did that well, which is what he did when I was a player too, even though as a high schooler, I didn't necessarily want to hear the criticism from my dad watching film on Saturdays and Sunday mornings after our games. I was a lot more apt to take it in at this point as a young adult. But I think the place that my dad helped me out the most when I didn't realize it until much later on was on air. People always talk about LeBron James when he gets new teammates. He asks them, hey, where do you want the ball at this spot on the court? Like, not just, hey, which spot on the floor, but like, do you want it hip high? Do you want it shoulder high? And he's able to put it in all those places. When I was going on air with my dad early in my career, he was setting things up so easily and handing me the ball in spots that he knew I was going to be able to go out and excel, so that those early reps, I could see the ball go through the basket a little bit more. It's like these quarterbacks that come up in the Shanahan-McVay trees and you get an offense that creates a healthy environment. I had a really healthy sports talk upbringing because I had the person there that knew me better than anyone else in that building was ever going to.
Yeah. And what about Mike Greenberg? Because like obviously you mentioned Robin Lundberg being so helpful in terms of how to design and orchestrate a show and build topics and things like that. And Greenberg did a lot of that for Mike and Mike. Was he somebody that you were able to kind of poke with that stuff as well?
Yeah, and I think just seeing it up close and personal for as long as I did, and then getting to sit in that chair at some points when I was doing, fill-in work, or I remember there was a stretch where they were moving into a new studio where they had us come in and do test shows. So this was never going to go out anywhere, but me and Jen Latta actually did like 2 weeks of shows testing out the new Mike and Mike set before it had opened at ESPN's headquarters. And after that especially, and seeing just all the traffic that goes through there and the amount of stuff that you have to manage, that Greeny, he's one of the best of that to ever do it, how effortlessly he was able to weave all of that in addition to helping hang where everything's going to be in a show and creating something compelling for people. Getting to see that up close and personal and trying to emulate certain points of that, no doubt a huge part also. He's one of, like I said, one of the best to ever do it in terms of hosting a show and the nuts and bolts of what goes along with that job.
Did you get to know Greeny growing up, or was it more like Greeny and your dad, they spent enough time together at work that you didn't really need to spend time with him outside of work?
No, I mean, we saw them on like occasions, but it was one of those things. They were also just always at different places in life. Greeny's kids are a lot younger than we are, so it wasn't like we had that space in life. Dad and mom were so busy carting us around to sporting events that, as I see now with a lot of my friends that are young parents with kids that are around that age, you don't have a ton of free time to do all that. They lived further downstate from us as well, so they weren't neighbors down the street that we could readily see. So we saw them at a lot of the big events with the show and the things that popped up along the way over the course of 17 years.
Yeah. You were at the final Mike and Mike show?
Yep.
What was that like?
Extremely emotional. I mean, for my whole family, I just, again, something that had been not only a part of our life, but the thing that changed all of our lives and allowed us to, be fortunate enough to have such a great life that my dad and mom had provided for us. That show had been the vehicle for that, and had been something that we had all, again, enjoyed sharing our dad with that wide audience, and seeing what that show meant to so many people, between that and then years later when dad signed off on ESPN radio for the last time on a show where at that point with Golic and Wingo I was a part of. In both of those junctures, seeing the response and the feedback from other peers inside the building, from the audience that had grown up around this show, it was really moving to see how much it had meant to so many people, and to hear the stories of, hey, a person who was going through a tough time and had lost a loved one found solace in this show, or a family that had welcomed a new baby into it had this on in the background and the husband got made fun of for, tweeting it into them without including his wife's name. And it just, again, I think seeing that connective tissue was a good reminder of why we all do this. in addition to getting a chance to storytell some of the most impressive athletes known to man, it's also that connection to other people who love the game the same way we do. And there aren't many shows ever that have done it as well as Mike and Mike did for as long as Mike and Mike did, especially at the national level.
How was then getting to be part of Golic and Wingo?
Yeah, it was incredible. Dad and I got to call a college football game together. Well, we got to call a couple on radio early in my time as I got into that. They kind of weaned me in on a 3-man booth doing some ESPN radio games, but then we had gotten a chance to call the Pinstripe Bowl together. And we both kind of looked at each other. It's like, oh, this is pretty cool. We didn't know ever when I came over to ESPN if us actually working together was going to get to be a part of that experience or not. And you know, the way it started off, I was on with them for an hour in the morning, basically because I was rolling in hot off 2 hours it takes doing solo radio. And so I was there to wake up the old guys and prod them. I always call it third chair syndrome. Like, you sit there in the third chair and you hear the conversation going on, and it's just like, all right, well, if everyone's saying the same thing over, like, you know, if everyone's agreeing on this, I can't just jump in with them. I've got to say something that rattles the cage a little bit. So I was kind of there to piss them off, which was kind of a fun role for me. But no, looking around and getting to do that, especially by the end with Dad, all 4 hours. And, you know, when that show ended, we were in the middle of the pandemic. So we had been doing that show from my dad's basement. You know, Trey lived down the street. We were all, you know, abiding by the rules at the time of the pandemic and being safe. So we all felt comfortable enough saying, hey, we can come together and in the space down here, do the show from here in the morning. And I think especially just getting to end it that way, being back in the house that I grew up with the person that raised me for this final run of his at the end of a prolific career at ESPN, and what he meant to the ESPN radio department was really cool. And it was funny for me because being on that show full time, a lot of the staff on that show was much closer to my age than they were to Dad's age. And they had grown up with him and Trey as these guys that everyone knew around the building. And Trey had been such a part of the NFL coverage for so long. Dad's a legend in the ESPN radio department. And so I could see moments where people might have been afraid to like check them or say something in the middle of a meeting. And I'm like, hell, me and this guy go way back. Like, I'll say whatever you need to him to make sure that we get this done. I'll needle him. I'll have a little bit of that tougher conversation. And so I do think it was such a fun experience in a lot of ways just to get to do this with the person that I had watched and the reason I had wanted to do any of this to begin with. But then to see how that relationship of father and son became coworker also and still is coworker now has been really, really gratifying.
And then what about getting to do afternoons and working with Chene?
Awesome. Her, you know, I was fortunate, her and Chris Canty, who I got to do the show with after Chene became a fixture now the way she is for the NBA coverage at ESPN. No one as good at what they did, like basketball, like Chene is, you know, her and her sister NECA are the Mannings of women's college basketball, two sisters that are number 1 overall picks, Pac-12 legends, and went on to be WNBA stars. No one that good at what they do should have any right to be as good a teammate as Chene also is. Like, came into work every day with so much energy, always had great ideas, treats everyone incredibly well, is so like smart and creative, and offers such unique insight so effortlessly. Like, we always, when you've got former players in the chair, you're trying to draw on that experience. And Chene had such varied experience in so many different parts of this process at the high level she'd played at. And she was able to communicate that so well in a way that, you know, people that are supremely great at their sport aren't always able to do, because sometimes those things just come naturally. So Chene, in addition to being an awesome friend, like, we had known each other throughout the hallways there, being some of the few young people when she came up and was drafted by the Sun, the Connecticut Sun. Like, we were just the young people that were there in the building at the time. Most of the people, even in my age bracket, were 4, 5, 6 years older than me. So Chene and I, being in that age range, being interested in a lot of the same things, we had been friends before we had gotten to be coworkers on air. And so getting to take that relationship to air was awesome. Watching the absolute rocket ship that she has been since then has been so cool to see other people notice what I saw immediately then, which is, hey, she's a superstar in this industry, and ESPN needs to hold on to her for dear life. And we saw what a phenomenon her and Andrea and Elle Duncan became during the women's basketball coverage, but she's been doing that for the NBA as well. So can't say enough good things about her, about Chris Canty, who, again, another guy, an incredibly prolific career, a mountain of a man, and someone who's also so dedicated, both of them, to doing the work necessary to be good at this. Like, both of them weren't just going to come in and rest on their careers. They were diving into, hey, this is what's happening in this game. This is what I see. And both brought such passion to it. It made it so much fun. Going to a time slot that I just wasn't used to. I had been all mornings up until that point. And so learning the machinations and how you structure a show when you're potentially the third or fourth voice that someone's heard talk about it, to do it with those two as partners in that process was incredible.
Yeah, and especially with at that time, this wasn't just a second career for Chene. Like, she was still playing at that point too, which is crazy.
One of the most impressive things I've ever seen doing this job. Obviously, 2020 coming off that, which is when Chene and I started the show in the fall of 2021. There was so much, uncertainty about so many things, and we had such a reckoning socially and with so many of the racial issues that came up because of tragedies over that summer. Chene and I were getting ready to do the show, so we were 4 to 7 p.m. Eastern when it got announced that, this was fall of 2020, I misspoke before, but when it got announced that the Milwaukee Bucks were going to be walking off the court after the shooting of Jacob Blake in Wisconsin, and they were going to walk off the court. The NBA was going to have their protest. The W was getting ready to do something similar as well in their bubble during that time period. And Chene was the vice president of the WNBAPA. Her sister Nneka was the president of the WNBAPA. And so as we're going on, it's a Scrap the Rundown show, which, happened a lot more in afternoons where you get breaking news.
Yeah.
And it was a Scrap the Rundown show. And we're not only talking about extremely sensitive subject matter, trying to reach out to guests that would be able to offer that insight, but Chene, as someone who's got a sister inside the bubble trying to respond to this, is also a young black woman in America dealing with the complicated feelings that came with this tragedy. And then also during every break was on the phone with her sister trying to figure out their plan, if they were going to get someone on ESPN, making all these moves. So she never stopped once during the 3 hours of that show as she processed all of this on the fly for both of her jobs in very similar but also very different ways. And I just remember sitting in there trying to be the best teammate I could as she was shepherding us and guiding us through all of this while also helping her sister do the same thing in a bubble that she wasn't in because of injury at that time. So cannot say enough things about how impressive that was to watch. And that was just who Chene was. She can always handle whatever's in front of her.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, and really cool to just now see, like you mentioned, the her platform at ESPN just start to take off with the WNBA and the NBA as well. She's really become a superstar there with their NBA coverage. The decision to leave ESPN, was that at all made easier by the fact that your dad had already left? Like, there was always such a stigma against leaving ESPN, like if you're working in sports media and you make it to ESPN, why would you give that up? And now it's becoming something that's a little bit more frequent. But was that decision at all helped by the fact that your dad had already left?
Yeah, I think seeing, dad have success after ESPN, seeing Stu Gatz and the guys from the Le Batard show that I was super close with have that kind of success. And just in general, by that point, again, unfortunately, I was at ESPN at a time where layoffs became a lot more of a common occurrence. And I had seen friends who had that job taken away from them and then have gone and found so much success after their time at ESPN, and talking to a lot of those people about their experience and what they saw on the other side. The feedback I got universally from everyone is there is life away from this place. As much as you enjoyed it and as much as I'm still grateful for how much ESPN afforded me early in my career and the opportunities, I've got nothing but good things to say about what the people there meant to me and still mean to me, and what that afforded me. The only reason I'm here and have even a shred of credibility is because the four letters gave me that opportunity and that backing. But yeah, seeing the success that they all had, but certainly, dad being someone I could talk to in my house, Stu Gatz being someone I can pick up the phone and call. I think all of that helped me feel a lot less trepidation. There was always going to be trepidation because it's a risk like anything else, but that definitely helped.
Yeah. And how is now getting to do the DraftKings show daily with your dad?
It's been great. It's been one of those things. Again, after it ended with Golic and Wingo, we were never sure we'd get this opportunity again. And so when we were kind of able to come together with DraftKings after a year of being there, and say, hey, what if we did this? Is that something you guys would be interested in? Can we support this? And their answer was an overwhelming yes. They've helped give us every resource they can to make the show a success. And, all of that's been great to see the way DraftKings as a company that was new to sports media at the time has grown into this and the way that they have and all the programming that they now can boast. But to then just get the opportunity to sit around with 2 hours a day and talk to my dad, which I think I appreciate more and more now. I turned 35 at the end of the month. And it's not to say I'm some seasoned vet or anything, but just, getting to be an adult closer to middle age and realizing, hey, you do see your family and friends a lot less often as life moves on and everything gets busy. To have 2 hours a day where I could sort of ground myself and remind myself like, hey, there's a lot of people that don't get to pick up the phone and talk to their dad anymore. And I get to sit on here and talk about sports, this thing that's been this common bond with us for so long. But, it means we get to travel together and do stuff for the show. It means that we get to talk off air about this. It just makes me more cognizant of, hey, make sure I'm staying in touch with my mom and dad as I continue to grow up and do this. And our lives all go in all these ways that happen as a part of growing up. I think in a lot of ways, just away from the microphone, I'm super grateful for what it's brought me in terms of being able to remain close to my family that I've been so close with for so long.
You mentioned the recognizing the nepotism in your career earlier. Is that something that did people inside the industry or at ESPN ever make comments or complain about it? Or was it mostly just social media comments?
Not that I ever heard. I mean, I'm sure someone did at some point. I'm sure there were people that did, but it never got to me. It was never that overt. And again, I always said I never begrudged anyone the way that they felt. I understood I had to come in and prove myself before anyone was going to believe that I was anyone other than Mike Golic's son. So, but no, none of it I ever heard. And, from the social media stuff, listen, it has an effect. And balancing a relationship with social media, I think, is something that everyone, regardless of being on air or not, is kind of a part of life in 2024. But that was also something I dealt with going back to being a college football recruit. I mean, there were a lot of people that were saying, hey, you're only getting a scholarship and going to Notre Dame because your dad went and played there and all of that stuff. So that part of my life I had been strangely used to up until that point. And I was a lot more confident in my ability as a broadcaster naturally than I was in my ability as a football player. So that helped a little bit.
Do you think, did it, obviously being your last name helped you get into the door, but did it also add more pressure? Just the fact that now you have this name to live up to, who has been so successful in the media industry already?
I think in some ways, I mean, listen, it was the same way for football. So again, like I said, I had a lot of practice with that, but the blessings of it so far outweighed. Like even if I had not gotten to work with my dad, having someone who knew how to navigate those same spaces in terms of the corporate structure at ESPN and the different ways to go about trying to find new opportunities and explore the stuff you're passionate about there, and just dealing with the day-to-day stuff of working in a profession I hadn't worked before, it would have been invaluable, let alone getting to learn from him in the ways I talked about before and getting the joy of doing it together. That always, to me, outweighed whatever the pressure there was. And there was early on, like I felt that, and I felt the insecurity of being the junior in the room and around those offices, but it was never to the point where I was like, man, I wish I had some other name or had some other upbringing. It was always the blessings so far outweighed any of the criticism or the pressure that I would put on myself because of that.
And you played with a Collinsworth at Notre Dame, not are you Jack's brother? Was it
Yeah,
Austin?
Jack's brother Austin was a player on the team when I was there. Yeah.
And then now you have another Notre Dame teammate recently getting into sports media, and Manti Te'o. Were you friends with Manti at all?
Yeah, I mean, we were. He was a few years younger than me on the team, so we didn't have that much time together. But obviously knew him from then, familiar with him as one of the leaders and most important players on the team for us at that point. And so, seeing him do Good Morning Football now, seeing, Kyle Rudolph, who was a roommate of mine, I'm the goddaughter or godparent of one of his daughters, getting into sports media at this point now. I know Golden Tate was doing some preseason stuff for the Lions. It's been fun to see. This is an industry full of Syracuse and Northwestern and Missouri grads. So every time someone from Notre Dame, I'm doing college football games now for Turner Sports covering the Mountain West on True TV, and JB Long, who's the play-by-play in the booth for me, a fellow Notre Dame grad. So we all got to hold on to each other tight when we make it to this level because they got enough of the orange and the purple stuff out there. We need more blue and gold in the ranks.
2012 was still kind of early on in social media, but what was it like being on the team as the catfishing story was happening?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when it broke, just because, we had gone through hearing about that story in the media coverage during the run-up of that season before the news broke that it was a catfishing story. And, I always tell people during the season, like, we were aware when it was first announced because obviously Manti is a teammate of ours. Like the fact that he lost, his girlfriend and his grandmother in such close time around that point, like you wrap your arms around a teammate and you're there for whatever they need. We had unfortunately had other guys on our team lose parents, lose loved ones. And so you always want to be there for your teammates. But as far as the media coverage of it, at some point for all of us, we were going through an undefeated season. None of us had experienced that before. So your head is such blinders on just trying to get through the next 5 minutes of every day, upholding a standard that can allow you to keep winning games like that. But I was at a postseason all-star game, the Raycom Stars and Stripes game, and it was me and Robbie Toma, who was a wide receiver on our team and who was one of Manti's closest friends. They had gone to Punahou together in Hawaii. They had come to Notre Dame together. And I was with Robbie down there when the news all broke. And you can imagine that news breaking around a bunch of football players from other schools. You're going to, get and hear a lot of grief from all those guys. But especially, being there for Robbie, who was super close to Manti at the time, and just, working through how stunning that was for us, just like it was everybody else, was wild.
Yeah. Do you think that story breaking when it did affected the national championship game?
No, like I know that it's fun to talk about that, but I just think Alabama was the better team that day.
Yeah.
We went into that game, and the number one question I always get that pisses me off was people are like, did you actually think you had a chance of winning that game? Hell yeah, we had the number one defense in the country all year. We had won 12 games. We had gone on the road and beaten Oklahoma at home. We had survived all these tough tests along the way. Like, yeah, we thought we had a chance to go in and win a football game. We were wrong and found that out very quickly. But, assigning any other kind of stuff to it, like who knows in the lead up to that, how difficult it had to be for Manti to try and prepare for a game of that caliber while also juggling the things that we found out later after that news broke were kind of going on and that he had known behind the scenes. But I still think at the end of the day, that was an Alabama team that was on the front end of the greatest dynasty the sport's ever seen. So they just were the better team that day.
How was Manti received by the locker room at that time?
As one of the leaders and most important players on the team. I mean, you don't see many off-ball linebackers with 7 interceptions. And for all of us to, see him through that season as he's getting more attention that he'd ever gotten.
Yeah.
I mean, Manti was one of the biggest recruits that Notre Dame had gotten during my time there, started early in his career, went through the growing pains, and then gets to this season where he finishes the Heisman Trophy runner-up. I mean, that guy is juggling a lot in terms of attention, but still going out and being a productive player that we could all count on in those spots. We were, as an offense, we were fine. We were, a good, not great offense. We averaged, 200 rushing, 200 receiving. So we were balanced and timely, but we were a defensive-led team. And so for us to know on offense, hey, we've got a margin for error because Manti Te'o and the rest of that incredible group over there are going to give us more opportunities because they are the strength of this team. It goes such a long way in empowering everyone else to feel like, hey, I don't have to go out there and play beyond myself on every given play because we've got guys that do that naturally.
Yeah. Well, he seems pretty comfortable over at NFL Network, so good for him. Hopefully, finding his niche in sports media. You mentioned calling games. Is that something like does that almost help fill the void of not being part of a football team anymore? Does calling games feel a little bit more closely like being part of a team and playing football, like the preparation level, just getting to be in the stadium with the crowd and all of that?
Yeah, it's funny. And every time I talk to, guys that are getting out of the game now who might be my peers age-wise, but, had long, prolific careers, it's the one thing I do say is the way you go about preparing to call a game, the energy on game day, what the job entails there of trying to show people the game through your eyes and find teachable moments when you can and tell the story of these teams, it is by far the closest thing you'll get to the environment that we played in. You're on the road with a team every week with you, your play-by-play, the sideline reporter, the producers and directors, and everyone in the truck. Like, it's that same mentality where, hey, we all might have different roles in the broadcast, but it's going to take all of us to make this thing work. And so it does. It scratches the itch in a way that few things can. It is one of my favorite things to do in this job, and it really is something I try and make sure I remind myself to take so seriously, because that is one of the spots where, like, calling college football games, I've been in their shoes. I know exactly what those players are going through for the most part. And so to want to tell their story in a way that does justice to their experience is something I don't take lightly, for sure.
And how much did you enjoy calling the Duke's Mayo Bowl?
That one was so fun in a lot of ways, and I've talked a lot about the teammates I was fortunate to happen, and I hope I've mentioned as many of the people as I can that have been a part of what's been a really, really fun journey so far through this job. But that fall with Anish Shroff and Taylor McGregor, who were the play-by-play and sideline reporter on that booth respectively, one of the most fun years I've had doing this job. Like, just two people who are so excellent at their craft. Anish obviously now enjoying a ton of success as well, in addition to calling the Panthers games for their home broadcast as the play-by-play there. I know Taylor's up with a great crew in college football right now at ESPN, and like, getting to work with both of them helped me get so much better, because I felt like, all right, every week I've got to raise my game because they're really good at this. But they're also like incredible teammates. Everyone was, down to try new things. Everyone wanted to share the ball. Like, it was just a true team environment in that way we were talking about. And the Duke's Mayo Bowl was kind of the culmination of a season where we'd all gotten to know each other. It's Friday night dinners, it's phone calls, it's the group text thread, and getting to know each other in a way where we know what we can do when we're all on the same page. And so walking into that game, understanding, hey, this is college football bowl season. Part of the fun of this is it's the dumbest thing imaginable. We watched a sentient Pop-Tart get eaten alive last year in a bowl game with a direct through line to where we started the Duke's Mayo Bowl. And so trusting each other enough to go to air with that and know, hey, we're all going to have fun and play our part in this. We're going to embrace the hilarity around this sport and try and do that while also, again, honoring the very good game that we had. Like, DK Joyner going out and playing quarterback in that game for South Carolina after taking no reps throughout that game and becoming the bowl game's MVP before their head coach Shane Beamer got a Mayo bath. It was incredible to watch. You had Sam Howell on the other side who was getting ready to go be an NFL quarterback who chose to play in that game. Like, there were all those things that we were excited to cover in addition to this goofy stuff. But we knew that we could pull it off because we had done it. We had had so much time together, and everyone was just so aligned in how we viewed the job and the sport that I again, can't say enough good things about them. They are two of, I think, the best at what they do in this industry, and to get a chance to not only know them as broadcasters, but to now have a friendship that'll last me the rest of a lifetime with everyone that was a part of that crew is awesome.
Whose idea was the goofy stuff? Whose idea was it to dunk the food in mayo?
So Anish was always kind of the ringleader of that stuff. He's another one. So incredible. And, he's walking around. We got to do a Syracuse Clemson game at the Dome with him, and walking around Syracuse with Anish Shroff is like walking around there with the Beatles. Like, everyone, all these Syracuse kids in their little shirt and ties in the press box are coming up and shaking his hand and asking him about stuff. Like, he was the mayor around there, and for good reason. He's so good at identifying, hey, these are the pivotal elements of storytelling for this game. These are the stakes that we need to show the audience are going into this game. And so he was the one that said, hey, we're the only bowl game that's going to douse the winning coach in mayo after this game. We got to set the table for that, pun fully intended. And so I think he had found a list of online, like, weird foods to combine with mayonnaise. And then from there, it just kind of got spitballing to this point where, like, well, what if we did it on air once a quarter? And the part of the process he let me pick was the food items that we were going to dunk. So he set it up there. I got my agency there. Me and Taylor McGregor kind of talked through some options and all made that happen.
Have you dunked an Oreo in mayo since?
I have, as you can imagine, and as I found out since then. And Will Levis is going through this right now in the NFL. Once you make yourself the mayo guy, you're the Mayo guy for good. And so I don't get through most interviews, most college football seasons without, which is awesome. Like, what a fun thing to be associated with between like that, the stuff that I got to do at ESPN is absurd and should not be allowed, and it was. And so getting to live out those dreams was awesome. But yes, when I got over to DraftKings, one of the first social videos we did involved me with a Mayo Oreo eating contest with one of the guys on our social team, which I, of course, cleaned up shop with. I was calling college football games with Learfield Audio for the last couple of years, and we did the Duke's Mayo Bowl to kickstart the 2023 season. A rematch of that game, actually, in North Carolina and South Carolina. So I think I dunked an Oreo in Mayo. I think I dunked pizza in Mayo in that one. It is a part of who I am now for me. And I still, I talk to Miller Yoho and the guys over at the Duke's Mayo Bowl all the time still. They're some of my favorite people in the sport because, again, they understand the soul of this really well. So, yeah, and I've told people, not a bad combination. Like, you've already got the Oreo cream, the stuff in there. It blends better than you'd expect.
Quite the legacy you're building. Mike, you were great. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate you.
That is Mike Golic Jr. I'm Brandon Contes. This is the Awful Announcing Podcast. Please rate and subscribe to this podcast. Please also subscribe to Awful Announcing's YouTube page. But regardless of how you consume Awful Announcing and the Awful Announcing Podcast, thanks for listening and be good.
Thanks for listening to the Awful Announcing Podcast. For the latest news spanning the sports media landscape and more, check out awfulannouncing.com and follow us at Awful Announcing.